In the shadowed fringes of Willow Creek, where the cornfields whispered secrets to the wind, the Ramsey farmhouse had stood like a sentinel of decay for over a century. Built in 1875 by Elias Ramsey, a stern farmer with a penchant for hoarding silver and grudges, the house was a sprawling two-story affair of weathered clapboard and sagging porches. Its chimney, long choked with soot, pointed accusingly at the sky, as if blaming the heavens for the family's downfall. By 1897, Elias and his wife, Beatrice, had sunk into desperation. Droughts had withered their crops, and debts gnawed at their bones like rats in the walls. That's when the traveling salesman arrived, Mr. Harlan Crow, a dapper man in a pinstripe suit, peddling miracle tonics from a horse-drawn cart. He knocked on their door one stormy evening, his gold pocket watch glinting like a talisman against the thunder. The Ramseys welcomed him with forced smiles and a meager supper of cornbread and salted pork. But Harlan's tales of distant cities and easy fortunes stirred their greed. As the night deepened, Beatrice slipped arsenic into his stew, her hands steady as she stirred the pot. Elias watched with cold eyes, his fork poised like a dagger. Harlan ate heartily, praising the meal between sips of sour wine, oblivious to the bitter aftertaste. By midnight, he slumped at the table, his watch slipping from limp fingers into Elias's palm. They dragged his body to the root cellar, burying him beneath sacks of potatoes, convinced the storm would wash away their sin. But Harlan didn't stay buried. Whispers began the next dawn, clinking silverware in empty rooms, the scrape of a chair at the table. The Ramseys grew gaunt, their eyes hollow as they set 3 places for every meal, as if inviting the ghost to join them. One by one, they vanished. Elias first, found weeks later with a fork clutched in his rigid hand, Beatrice last, her screams echoing from the kitchen like shattering glass. The house was abandoned, the table forever laid for 3, 2 for the hosts who had fled into madness, and 1 for the eternal guest who refused to leave. Over the decades, the legend festered like an open wound. Children dared each other to peek through the lace-curtained windows, where shadows danced without light. Lovers parked nearby, only to speed away at the sound of phantom laughter. Realtors came and went, their for sale signs rusting in the yard, but no buyer could stomach the chill that seeped from the floorboards. In October of 2025, with the leaves turning blood red under a harvest moon, Tom Hargrove arrived. At 42, Tom was a jaded realtor from the city, divorced and drowning in alimony payments. Willow Creek was his last shot at cheap inheritance from a distant aunt who swore the property was cursed but valuable. He pulled up in his battered SUV at dusk, the engine ticking like a countdown as he stepped onto the overgrown path. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, charred meat. No, just imagination, he told himself, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder. The front door hung ajar on rusted hinges, groaning a welcome as Tom pushed inside. Dust motes swirled in the fading light, settling on faded wallpaper patterned with thorny roses. The parlor was a tomb of relics, a grandfather clock frozen at 11:47, its hands bent as if in agony, a phonograph with a cracked horn, silent but for the faint scratch of a needle in his mind. Tom's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing spiderwebs thick as veils. He jotted notes: structural integrity poor, foundation cracked, his voice echoing unnaturally loud. Just an old house, he muttered, though his pulse quickened at the sudden drop in temperature. Upstairs, bedrooms held relics of lives interrupted, a child's dress yellowed on a hook, a diary splayed open to a page of frantic scrawls about the man who eats without a mouth. Hunger gnawed at him by the time he descended to the kitchen, the heart of the house's horror. It was a cavernous room, dominated by a scarred oak table that seemed too sturdy amid the ruin. 3 place settings awaited, pristine in their decay, chipped porcelain plates dusted with what looked like ancient crumbs, tarnished silverware aligned with military precision, and napkins folded into accusing points. At the head sat an empty chair, its cushions sagging as if from recent weight. Tom's stomach rumbled despite the unease. A long day on the road, skipped lunch. He chuckled nervously, setting his briefcase down. Might as well, he said to the empty air, pulling out the chair. It scraped against the floorboards like nails on bone, louder than it should have. He sat, the wood cool beneath him, and reached for the dusty pitcher in the center. It was half full of cloudy water that sloshed invitingly, though he could swear it had been bone dry when he entered. Pouring a glass, he sipped tasteless, but quenching. On each plate lay a fork, spoon, and knife, their handles engraved with faint initials, E, R, B, R, and H, C. Harlan Crow, he realized with a shiver, recalling the legend from his aunt's yellowed clippings. Pushing the thought aside, Tom unpacked a protein bar from his pocket, crumbling it onto his plate like an offering. As he chewed, the air hummed a low sizzle, like fat rendering in a pan over an unseen flame. The scent intensified, savory, almost appetizing, with an undercurrent of bitterness that made his tongue tingle. Then, a chair scraped back across the room. Not as the one at the foot of the table, opposite him. Tom's head snapped up, crumbs tumbling from his lips. The kitchen was empty, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking. Silence answered, broken only by the drip of a faucet that hadn't worked in decades. He forced a laugh. Wind, probably. Old house settling. But his eyes darted to the napkin in his lap, now bearing a greasy stain that hadn't been there, a dark thumbprint, smudged as if from handling raw meat. Emboldened by denial, Tom continued his meal, sketching property values on a notepad. Footsteps began, then slow, deliberate thuds circling the table, just beyond the flashlight's reach. Heavy boots on hollow wood, circling clockwise, then counterclockwise, like a predator sizing up prey. Tom's pen froze mid-stroke. "Who's there?" No answer, but the sizzle grew louder, accompanied by the clink of invisible utensils. A draft brushed his neck, carrying a whisper past the salt. The voice was gravelly, choked with earth and resentment, emerging from the space between his chair and the wall. He spun, knocking over his glass. Water spilled across the table, soaking the crumbs into a pasty sludge that reeked of arsenic and regret. The chairs remained empty, but now all 3 napkins bore stains his own, plus 2 more, one embroidered with faded beads, the other pristine but for a single drop of what looked like congealed blood. Panic rising, Tom fumbled for his phone, but the screen flickered to life, showing 11:47, the frozen time of the clock upstairs. In his watch, a cheap digital he'd worn for years, began ticking backward, 6, 2, 6, 1, 6, 0. The footsteps paused behind him. A cold breath ghosted his ear. "The stew was delightful, Elias. But you've grown stingy with the portions." Tom's blood turned to ice. He bolted upright, chair toppling, and lunged for the door. It slammed shut before his fingers grazed the knob, the latch clicking with finality. Pounding it yielded nothing, though it felt warm, pulsing like flesh. From the table came laughter, 3 voices now, overlapping in discord, Beatrice's shrill trill, Elias's guttural rumble, and Harlan's rasping drawl. "Join us," they chorused, the words slithering from the walls. The table set. "Forever." Tom whirled, back to the door, as shapes coalesced in the gloom. At the head of the table sat Elias, gaunt and wild-eyed, fork raised like a toast. Beatrice hovered to his left, her dress a shroud of mildew, smiling with teeth blackened by poison. And opposite, in the chair that had scraped back, lounged Harlan Crow, pinstripes crisp, eyes gleaming with unnatural hunger. His gold watch dangled from a spectral chain, ticking in reverse unison with Tom's. "You've the look of a traveler," Harlan said, voice like grinding bones. "Sit. Share the meal. It's been so long since we had fresh company." Screaming, Tom grabbed a knife from the table, slashing wildly. The blade passed through mist, clattering harmlessly. The figures didn't advance, they simply waited, utensils poised, as the air filled with the aroma of stew, rich, inviting, lethal. His vision blurred, the arsenic's echo seeping into his veins through the tainted water. He collapsed to his knees, the watch on his wrist now reading 1897,000, looping eternally. "Please," he gasped, but the plea twisted into a chuckle, his own voice merging with theirs. "By morning." The front door hung open once more, swaying in the breeze. The kitchen table gleamed under a shaft of sunlight, reset meticulously for 3, plates wiped clean, napkins refolded, the pitcher brimming anew. Tom's SUV idled in the drive, keys in the ignition, as if he'd simply stepped away. But locals in Willow Creek whispered of a fourth shadow now, a man in a rumpled suit joining the endless circuit around the farmhouse at dusk. Realtors still came, drawn by whispers of a bargain, but none left with more than a greasy stain on their sleeve and a watch that ticked backward into the grave. The dinner guest had room for one more, after all, and the stew was always simmering, waiting for the next hungry soul to pull up a chair.